Good morning. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Karl and I'm part of the church here. Now, just about exactly 3 years ago, I was scheduled to come and preach here. And the week beforehand, I was in Fiji and I was over there at a conference. I work for a mission organisation. Our team for the Pacific Islands was having a conference there in Fiji, and so I was over there as part of that. And as I got ready to come back and fly back, I got notifications on my phone that my flight was delayed, and then that my flight was cancelled. And then the next day, my flight was cancelled again, and this meant that I wasn't able to make it back on the Sunday to preach. Now, the reason for this, if you remember 3 years ago in January, we had the huge floods here. And so for 4 days, I was stuck in Fiji. I know, terrible place to be stuck, right? Now, last week, I was in Sydney for a conference for our mission organisation again. Our New Zealand team was with the corresponding Australian team there. And so I was flying back last night and I was there at the airport at Sydney and see lightning strikes out the window. And I think, okay, that's not usually a good sign. A little bit later, about half an hour later, an announcement comes over the loudspeaker that the flight to Wellington has been cancelled. And I'm thinking, oh, okay, this is not looking too good at all. And I start to think, okay, am I needing to call the church again in January to say, look, I'm actually not going to be here to preach as scheduled? Now, as it turned out, the plane that I was due to come back on wasn't able to land in Sydney, so it had been diverted to Brisbane because there were, these big storms in Sydney, and with some of the stuff that I've read this morning, they had trees falling over and blocking roads and things like that, and all sorts of bad weather in Sydney. Very terrible storm. But then the plane was able to finally get back to Sydney from Brisbane and was able to take us. And the plane did get in early this morning. Now, I don't think I've ever been on a plane that has flown so fast. I've never been on the Concorde. I know roughly that the speed of sound is about 1,000 kilometres per hour. And I was watching on the flight map, and I saw we got up to 983 kilometres per hour. And I didn't know that our passenger jets could go that fast. But as you can see, I am here, and I am with you. And I've been able to have a story to tell you about this experience as well, which is wonderful. And today, I am going to be talking to you about story and about how God uses stories in our lives. Now, Jesus told lots of stories. Now, if you turn to Matthew chapter 13 with me, and we'll start at verse 3, and this is a famous story that Jesus told. It starts off saying that he told them many things in parables. And it says, he said, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still other seed fell on good soil, where it produced the crop 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. Whoever has ears, let them hear. Now then his disciples came up to him and asked, why do you speak to the people in parables? And his response is something that I've always found very interesting. He said, because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and they will have abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. This is why I speak to them in parables, he said. And then he goes to quote from Isaiah. He said, though seeing, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not hear or understand. In them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. You'll be ever hearing, but never understanding. You'll be ever seeing, but never perceiving. For this people's hearts have become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. Now, that seems a rather cryptic response to the disciples' question, don't you think? At first reading, it seems as if Jesus doesn't want the people to believe or understand his message. That's what it seems like when we read it. And surely that jars with our understanding of who God is. That God is not wanting anyone to perish. But we read here and it seems like, no, I'm trying to hide the understanding of the message from this people. That's what it seems like. Now I want to take you a bit deeper into this to see what God is actually doing. And to do this, we need to understand more about story and how story works in our lives. Now, I wonder if any of you are the sort of people that whenever you look up and see clouds in the sky, you can see an animal or a face, or you see the shape of a tree and it looks like some particular person or thing, or you see faces in rocks or things like that. I can see some of you nodding or smiling there, either because you are that type of person or you know someone who is that type of person. And they say, oh, can you see that face in there? And you look and you squint and you try and work out what is that? And then, oh, okay, this is why you think it's that way. This is a natural thing that we all do as humans. We look for meaning in everything in our lives. And this is part of how we're hardwired. And a story is simply a series of events with a meaning attached. Now, I started off telling a story. And that story, the meaning there, with everything in order, like everyone saw that I was here today. So you weren't very worried that the story was going to be that I wasn't actually able to make it this morning. But it drew you into my experience of this is a repeated part of my life that travel plans get disrupted by putting the series of events in order. A researcher, Jonathan Gottschall, said that humans live in a storm of stories. We live in stories all day long, and we dream in stories all night long. We communicate through stories, and we learn from them. We collapse gratefully into stories after a long day at work. Without personal life stories to organize our experience, our own lives would lack coherence and meaning. Now, Homo sapiens, which means wise man, is a pretty good definition for our species. But it goes on to say that Homo fictus, or fiction man, or story man, would be about as accurate. He says man is a storytelling animal. And we see this all throughout. So Job said, God has made me a byword to everyone, a man in whose face people spit. Now, byword isn't a word that we use very often in today's speech. We would probably say that God has made Job's life as a cautionary tale. In other words, Job is looking at his life as a story, and he sees it as a story whose ending is not good. It has a bad ending. And this is how it looks like. Job was looking at his life and saying, it's a tragedy. It's an object lesson, so people look at me and say, don't be like Job. And in the middle of his life, he was reading his life as a story. For you, in the middle of your life, you are reading your life as a story. You are interpreting everything that happens from day to day as part of a story. And sometimes the events that happen, they might change the story that you are interpreting your life as, but you can't help but interpret your life as a story. So we are always telling stories, and we're always interpreting our own life through story. And wherever humans have been, all throughout history, we have told stories. From the cave paintings of prehistoric humans, they were telling stories. If you look at them and you imagine them in flickering firelight, you can see the story of a great hunt of animals to provide food, to keep them fed through the winter. You can see those stories come alive through that. To today, we have these massive IMAX cineplexes where we go to listen to stories and watch stories. We can tell stories that have a huge scope or are really tiny. Ernest Hemingway supposedly had the world's shortest story of just 6 words. For sale, baby shoes, never worn. You hear that? You put the pieces of information together, and you've got the story that is piecing together of what has happened. We can't help it. We fill in all of those details so that there is a story there. But story is much more than just something we do. Story, it has the power to change us. We are constantly spinning stories in our heads all the time. We can't help it. At the rate of about 100 daydreams per hour. Have you ever thought about that? That's how much the average human daydreams, 100 daydreams per hour. Which means that some of you are probably spinning up daydreams right now. But if you are engrossed in a good story, do you know what that does? Our rate of spinning daydreams goes down. The better the story, the lower the daydreams are. Now, you might have noticed that if you're watching a really good movie, or if someone is telling a really good story. You're more likely to notice it happening when the opposite is happening. When the movie loses your interest, that's when you start daydreaming and thinking about other things, or not paying attention to what happens because it has lost your interest. So you start daydreaming. But a really good story, you look back and you say, I was just engrossed in that. It had my attention the whole time. I was gripped all of the way through. Nothing focuses our minds like a good story. And this is because stories have the power to transport us. The reason that our daydreaming up of stories almost completely vanishes when we're engaged in a good story is because when we are truly engaged with a good story, we don't engage in the role of a detached spectator, but instead of an actual participant. We put ourselves in the middle of a story. And you'll know this when you are engaged in a good story. Because you know what you'll do? When something funny happens, you'll laugh. When there are moments of tension, you grip your hands. When it plumbs the emotional depths, we cry. We do that because the story has gripped us and got us completely engaged. It changes us. It puts us in the experience of other people. We mentally, emotionally live the story so it gets our entire attention. Now, the neuroeconomist Paul Zak studies how this works at a brain level. So what he did was he paid research subjects $20. These are usually university students who could really do with an extra $20. And then he had them read a sad and compelling story about a father and his terminally ill son, taking blood samples from them before and after. Again, it's poor university students that will give blood samples just for $20. Now, at the end of the study, subjects were given the chance to donate money to a charity serving sick kids. After the story, the blood samples showed spikes of oxytocin in the blood. Oxytocin has been called the empathy chemical. And the more oxytocin there was in the blood, the more that these cash-strapped, empathy-drunk students donated to charity. On average, they donated about half of what they got, about half of the $20. This study suggests that stories change our behaviors by changing our actual brain chemistry. But this change only occurs when the information is presented as a classic story. If the information is presented without story, there is no behavior change. It seems that story is hardwired into our biology. And you might wonder why that is. Now, the fact that this is true is not a new thing. And it's not a new discovery. Shakespeare wrote in Hamlet, getting close to 500 years ago now, as Hamlet was attempting to coax a confession out of usurping uncle. He says, "The play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king." In other words, Hamlet knew that the story was the way to get at the heart and get the emotions of his uncle. But Claudius was not the first king that someone attempted to use a story to change their behavior with. Famously, back in the time of King David, after King David had slept with Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, and had got Bathsheba pregnant, and then, in an attempt to cover up his wrongdoing, had arranged for Uriah to be killed in battle. Murder at another person's hand. Nathan the prophet knew what David had done and knew that it was wrong, and he had to confront the king about his behavior. Nathan did not come in with a list of the facts. He did not come in with a list of the laws a list of God's laws that David had broken. No. Nathan told a story. He told a story about a man who had a pet lamb that was taken from him by a rich neighbor. And at the end of that story, David's blood boiled with anger because of the injustice portrayed in this story. And then Nathan switched and said, "You are the man. You are the one who has perpetrated this injustice." And it cut to David's heart. The power of the story enabled David to put himself in the place of the one whom the injustice had been done to, and then enabled him to see that he was the perpetrator of the injustice and brought him to the point of repentance. God uses stories to connect with us, to focus our attention on Him in the way that only stories can. Maybe that's why the Bible is so full of stories. Approximately 3/4 of the Bible is narrative. The didactic instruction that we get in Deuteronomy or the propositional logic of Romans is not what makes up most of the Bible. Most of the Bible is made up of story. In fact, it is accurate in some ways to describe the Bible as myth. Now, by myth, I don't mean a story that's not true. Right? Sometimes we hear myth and we think that. But myth in the classical meaning is a story that explains the world. And this is what the Bible is. It's a story that explains the world. It explains the relationship between God, between us, and the world that we live in that God made. It explains how that all fits together. Now, you may be familiar with various myths. And if you think about this meaning of a myth as a story that makes sense of the world, that explains the world, then you can see how this works. Like, if you've been to school here in New Zealand, you'd be familiar of the myth of Maui going out in his waka and fishing up with his grandmother's jawbone the North Island, which is shaped something like a fish. Now, this is a story that explains why the land of New Zealand looks like the land of New Zealand. You know, we can take a look and we see that the North Island looks a bit like a fish, maybe like a ray. And we can see that the South Island, long like a canoe, and Stewart Island like a fish hook if you look at it in a certain way. Again, maybe you're the sort of person that needs to see shapes and clouds very easily to see all of these things, but you can see that it explains things in a certain way. You may say, but it's not a true story. It doesn't tell us what really happened. Of course, a myth may be true or it may not, because it's about explaining how we get sense out of the world. I don't think any of us really think we're standing on the carcass of a giant fish right now. But there is a sense that the story of continental plates drifting and charging into each other, creating mountain ranges, and volcanoes raising land out of the sea, are as much myth as the tales of Maui. True or false, these stories explain where we fit in the world and what the world is. They give us the meaning. C.S. Lewis even argues that the myths of culture around the world were sent by God to prepare them for the good news of the coming of Jesus. He said that God sent the human race what I call good dreams. I mean those queer stories scattered all through the heathen religions about a God who dies and comes to life again, and by his death is somehow given new life to men. So C.S. Lewis saw in these heathen religions that their stories had grains of truth in them that made people ready to be able to receive the good news of Jesus. C.S. Lewis had grown up as a lover of especially the Nordic myths. They awakened in him a desire for something beyond the world. Something almost like nostalgia, but not nostalgia for something he had already experienced, but for something he had never experienced, but somehow felt like he was made for. He used the German word Sehnsucht to describe this feeling. Sehnsucht is something that can be aroused by a number of different phenomena: music, art, a sunset, a mountain, or in the case of Lewis, a story. And God used the Sehnsucht that Lewis experienced when he read Nordic myths to lead Lewis to himself. Late one night, Lewis was up in deep discussion and debate with his friends J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and Hugo Dyson. They were debating the atonement. They were debating how Christ's death pays for humanity's sins. And Lewis was offended by the concept. He thought that was vulgar. Tolkien and Dyson pointed out that Lewis loved these sorts of ideas when he found them in the Nordic or the classical Greek myths, because he could see that they pointed to a greater meaning. And so why should Lewis not have the same reaction when he encountered such a story in the Bible? They said the gospel accounts of Christ dying and rising from the dead were a myth that was actually true. A true story that explains our place in the world. They said the gospel accounts of Christ dying and rising from the dead really happened. And this conversation, Lewis would later consider to be pivotal in his coming to faith in Christ. You see, God was using story to get to Lewis's heart. So as beings who are made in the image of God, we have been empowered to tell stories. We can't help but tell stories, and we can't help but respond to stories because we've been made that way. And so we see these stories that we respond to in this way. And maybe there are stories like The Lord of the Rings or Lewis's Narnia that evoke that resonance in your heart. The Pixar director Andrew Stanton is a believer. He's the director who directed Finding Nemo and WALL-E. And so we see that as he tells the story about the life of fish, he ends up telling the story of a father who searched the entire ocean to find his son. Doesn't that sound like something you've read in the Bible somewhere? God broke through into that story that he was telling. And God breaks through into the stories that we tell. He breaks through into our stories of our lives as well. And this is because God is always telling stories, all through the Bible. Madeline Langler, the author, described Jesus as God telling stories, which I think is a profound description. And it's what we saw right at the beginning. He told a story about a farmer scattering seed. And he told so many other parables, so many other stories. So his disciples asked him, "Why are you telling stories?" And so now that we understand how story works and what story does, if we go back and we take a look at the passage, it says, "You'll be ever hearing but never understanding. You'll be ever seeing but never perceiving. This people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn and be healed. Now, when we read this now with this understanding of both how we are created to see our lives and the world in story, and how God has been communicating through story throughout the whole time of his revelation, this gives us another perspective on this passage. Think about how ears become dull. Our ears don't become dull from not hearing any noises. Our ears become dull from being exposed to too much noise. Our eyes don't fail because they don't look at things. Our eyes fail because they're exposed to too much light, like looking at the sun or looking at our smartphones. Why do we get calluses? Now, I remember when I ran a half marathon. When I got home and took my shoes off at the end, my feet were blistered and bloody because they had been rubbing against the shoes for 21 kilometers. It's that constant rubbing that creates blisters. Now, after you've been having these blisters for a while, the blisters turn into calluses. So it starts off that when we first have that rubbing, that poking, that prodding, we respond in a way that gets our attention. You can't ignore blisters for very long. But if you keep on ignoring them, eventually the blisters become calluses. The calloused heart doesn't come about all of a sudden. It comes about by repeatedly ignoring God's poking and prodding of our hearts. And what have we just learned? That the most powerful way to poke and prod a human's heart is story. Why was Jesus talking to the people in stories? Because that's the way to get their attention. And the end result is either going to be that people will turn and be healed. Or if they don't, God is going to continue to shine his gospel into our face, to blare it into our ears, to poke and prod our hearts until either we turn to him and be healed, or until our hearts become so calloused that we cannot feel the pokes and prods anymore. This is not God hiding his good news from people. This is God promising to put his good news in people's faces so much until the only reason that they don't see it and respond to it anymore is because they have resisted it. They have ignored it. They have closed their heart to it. So in summary, God has made us as storytelling creatures. And as creatures that are driven by and motivated by and impacted by stories. And God uses these stories to draw us to himself. He is the author of the grand narrative, inserted himself in this story. And he's commissioned us to tell his story, to draw people to himself. So what does that mean for us here today? Firstly, for anyone who has not come to the point where Jesus has turned their life around, then maybe you can sense God communicating to you through these stories. Maybe God is grabbing your attention. Maybe hearing about Jesus, a God who is offering a good news of a changed life through his sacrifice, is something that is poking and prodding your heart. If so, then do not resist. Do not allow your heart to become calloused. Or maybe the good news of those stories for you, now there's something that's only very faintly heard or seen or felt. Maybe the calluses have started to build up already. Maybe they used to be much clearer, but for whatever reason, maybe the thought of what the alternative would be or what it would involve to give your life over to Jesus seemed like too big a sacrifice. Or maybe you want to do it on your own. You feel that it's important to be independent and to be able to get through the struggles of life on your own. Or maybe there's some other reason. But however faint you're hearing or seeing or feeling that story, it's not too late to respond. Because God is still calling to you right now to turn to him, even if you can only hear weakly. He has good news for you. Or maybe you've experienced Jesus' life-changing power and you are following Jesus. And if so, you have a story, and as we've seen, that story is powerful. I came to believe in Christ because someone told me how God had changed their life. Maybe God is prompting you to tell your story of a changed life to someone around you. God promises to use stories to work powerfully in people's hearts. So I want you to think about, who might God be prompting you to tell your story to? Maybe you could be part of God's promise to prod people's hearts so that they respond to him in faith. Remember that Jesus has promised that God will use story to continue to call people to recognize the good news of forgiveness of sins and new life that he offers. Now let me pray for you, and as I pray, the band is going to come up.